All right. When we were talking about all this stuff last week, a couple of classes ago, about reform and the various ways that the middle class reformers wanted to improve the quality of life for all Americans, inevitably the conversation turned to slavery and then women's rights. From the beginning of this country, slavery was like that dirty secret that nobody wanted to talk about. And I've already said this a few times. We left it out of the Declaration of Independence because we wanted Southerners and Northerners to sign the document. We left it out of the Constitution because we wanted Southerners and Northerners to sign the document. When Americans started spreading westward and we brought in a brand new slave state like Missouri, we created a brand new free state, Maine, to keep the balance. But during this period, the 1830s, there was a growing number of people that just saw slavery wasn't something you can just sweep under the rug and say, whatever, that's the Southerners' problem. I don't want to cause any trouble. And there was a desire to, quote-unquote, solve this problem. The first solution was colonization. And Abraham Lincoln, for the longest time, himself believed that colonization was something to consider. Essentially, we stole them from Africa, let's send them back. Now, this was a good idea to some people because the notion was this country is so rooted in racism that we're never going to have a situation where everybody's going to be happy with each other. So why not just solve the problem and send them back from where we stole them? Northerners agreed with this. Southerners agreed with this for different reasons. And it seemed like a good way to solve the problem, because nobody was comfortable with freeing the slaves and having them stay in America. Why? Because the notion was if you free them in the South, they're going to come north and take jobs. Or they're going to move next door to me. And then blah, 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 blah. Because obviously the whole country is racist. It's not just Southerners that are racist. But the problem with colonization is that blacks themselves, their response, there were many who volunteered to leave, but blacks themselves, the overwhelming majority of them said, why would I go back to Africa? I was born and raised here. My family was born and raised here. No one I know just came from Africa or the Caribbean. This initial migration happened 300 years ago. Why would I go back? Why don't you go back to Africa? You know, because humanity began in Africa. I'm not being flip here. All humanity began in Africa. That's where the oldest bones are. So the response to colonization was a much more militant response, which is militant abolitionism, which is get rid of slavery regardless of the political, social, economic consequences. Militant abolitionism didn't take any prisoners. The people that didn't want to talk about slavery hated the militant abolitionists. Frederick Douglass, militant abolitionist, where he told you to your face, if you do not fight against slavery, you are a hypocrite. You cannot invite me to speak here, Frederick Douglass, and then be okay with slavery in the South. You either have to be against it top to bottom, or you're simply as bad as the slaveholders. And he said this to everybody. Now, their answer was simple. Slavery is a sin. If you continue to tolerate it, that makes you a sinner. So it makes you a bad Christian and it makes you a bad American, because Americans are supposed to believe in equality. So we are going to bring up slavery over and over again and make it inconvenient for everybody. And the only way to solve it is to get rid of it right now. Not gradually. Don't pay off the slaveholders. Just get rid of it right away. And militant abolitionists were not interested in just abolish the slave. They wanted complete equality now. This was a pretty revolutionary thing to be calling for in the 1830s and 40s. It was already a big deal to say we have to legally abolish slavery. But then to also take the next step and say we believe in the complete equality of blacks and whites, period, was revolution times 100. So the abolitionists didn't have a whole lot of friends. But the thing was they had to make friends. because the only way they were going to be effective is if they can get enough people that demanded of their politicians that their politicians take a stand on slavery. And so it was a long haul. But they weren't going anywhere because they were motivated by basically almost like a religious fervor. Let me just push ahead. Yeah. Besides Frederick Douglass, the guy at the basis of the abolitionist movement is William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison, who published his newspaper, The Liberator, out of Boston, which right from the very beginning, Boston and New England in general was known as an incredibly liberal and racially tolerant part of the country, partly because there was hardly any blacks there, free or slave. His message was very straightforward. Get rid of slavery, and don't send blacks back to Africa, incorporate them into society as equals. This was a revolutionary proposition, and William Lloyd Garrison was lucky to be publishing in Boston, because if he put this newspaper out anywhere else in the country, his building would have been burned and he would have likely been murdered, because other abolitionists suffered murder, arson, vandalism, etc. And look at this title of his, this is what the Liberator newspaper, every newspaper had this banner across the top, right? Do you all know what this is here? What does it look like? What's that? Yeah. You can over here?
War.
Well, not so much war, but emancipation, productive labor, clearly happiness. Essentially, they were saying, this is what you're used to, but this is the way it can be. And you remember the cartoon of the Boston Massacre, right? My point here is that at this time, where everybody is reading the newspaper, everybody is politically involved, the visual image was everything. And by the way, the title was no accident. The Liberator, right? We've already done Rick Douglass. Let me see. Let me just push ahead. Now, yeah. Okay. The abolitionists tapped into a variety of things that worked out really well for them. This was a time of increasing democracy. The vote was given to all white men. This was also a time where politics became mass politics. Mass politics meaning there were so many voters. The goal was to get as many of your people to the election, to the ballot box, and keep your opponent away, which meant the newspapers had sensational stories. There was lots and lots of public speeches, lots and lots of conventions. The abolitionists tapped into this very politics as entertainment, and they put out endless pamphlets, petitions, newspapers. But most importantly, they gave speeches all over the country, sometimes at great risk to their lives, because many whites were simply white supremacists. They had no interest hearing about the complete equality of blacks and whites, even in the North. But they did this, and they tied into this notion that democracy is you have to kick in. If you want to be a citizen, it's not just about voting, you've got to participate. And they tied into it. And the goal was to simply change people's minds. So the reason I had you read Frederick Douglass's 4th of July speech is because the goal was for him to take people who themselves thought, I don't have any problem, I'm not a racist. Look, I invited Frederick Douglass. The goal was to change their minds. And if you can change their minds, maybe slowly but surely, you reach a tipping point where people expect from their politicians a stand on slavery. It didn't happen in the 1830s. It didn't happen in the 1840s. But by the 1850s, politicians recognized that their constituents expected them to have a public stance on slavery. Either you're for it, or you are completely against it, or you're somewhere in the middle where you're okay with it in the South, but you don't want it to expand anymore in America. The abolitionists made it impossible for a politician not to have an opinion on slavery. Let me push ahead. The abolitionists also had a very interesting take on freedom. In the market revolution, one definition of freedom was individualism. Leave me alone, allow me to work hard, keep the benefits of my labor. The reformers, the middle-class reformers, had another definition of liberty or freedom, individualism. They were concerned for those people that if you did leave them alone, they would be victims of their own, whatever, illnesses or problems, alcoholism, whatever the case may be, gambling, and so they couldn't take care of themselves. They couldn't enjoy their full individualism, and they needed help. The abolitionists took this idea of individual self-fulfillment that was common during the market revolution, and they said, if you believe in individual self-fulfillment, then how can you support slavery, where those people don't even have the basic control over their bodies and their actions? If you believe in liberty and individual self-fulfillment, then you must believe in the abolition of slavery. And these people to have the freedom, the right over their own actions, to rise and fall by their own choices. It was a bit of a stretch, but like the women's rights activists, it was tapping into an already accepted definition of liberty and putting a spin on it to bring more and more people towards their end of the argument. Now we can get to the next one. Now, all right, this is what I want to leave you with in terms of abolitionism. The abolitionists had a lot of enemies. White supremacists, racists, people that had business with the South, people that made money from the slave trade. But slowly but surely, they got allies. And the reason was because of all the enemies they had. First off, news started spreading that the abolitionists were being physically assaulted when they gave speeches against slavery. Their newspapers were being burned. Abolitionists were being murdered simply for speaking ideas. Politically, in the South, when pamphlets were mailed calling for the abolition of slavery, they were taken out of the mail and destroyed, a federal crime which was never prosecuted by the federal government. In the House of Representatives, abolitionists kept delivering petitions asking for a discussion on slavery, the abolition of slavery. But the House of Representatives, between 1836 and 1844, put a rule, a gag rule that says we're not talking about slavery. We're just simply not talking about it. This became problematic for a lot of Americans, not because they changed their mind about slavery and not because they changed their mind about race or black people, because they saw that basic civil liberties of the abolitionists were being destroyed. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of the mail, and your government was cutting out discussion. And all of this was aimed at slavery, but more and more Northerners started thinking, if civil rights and basic laws are being ignored because of slavery, what other civil rights will be ignored and thrown out? And that's a problem for me, because I don't care about slavery, but I do care about my civil rights. And if my government's ignoring them, then what's next? And that's when the abolitionists started getting more and more support. Because what changed was there was a slight change in people's view of black and white relations, but more and more people got sick and tired of Southerners and slaveholders controlling government policy. And they essentially got fed up, and they said, enough is enough. What else do you want from us? Slavery is guaranteed in the Constitution. You're allowed to bring your slaves out west. But now you have all these other requirements, and you're interfering with existing civil rights. Enough is enough. This tension explodes in the 1850s. And then you have the Civil War, but that's a different conversation. Wow. I have to pick this up next class. But this is where I want to give you very briefly where feminism comes from in this country. The early feminists were not women's rights advocates. They were abolitionists. All right? The only really acceptable public place that a woman could have in the early 19th century was in reform organizations, charitable organizations, and many white middle-class women joined the abolitionist movement. They wrote, they gave speeches, they did a lot of things. But at a certain point, in the 1840s, when women went to the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London, they were seated separately from the men. And this realization that no matter how much effort women made on behalf of the liberation of slaves, they were still having to fight for the liberation of women from male supremacy, galvanized these women that began as abolitionists. They came back to America and realized it had to be a two-pronged fight. You had to fight for abolition, but you had to also fight for women's rights, because both of them had to happen. And that's when you get the Declaration of the Rights of Women, or Declaration of Sentiments that you read for me today. So it's not a coincidence that the Declaration of Sentiments pinpoints what they would see as the falsity of the Declaration of Independence, just like Frederick Douglass pinpointed the falsity of the Declaration of Independence in his speech. It's not a coincidence. It comes from the same place. And the women's rights activists had the exact same definition of liberty as the abolitionists did. If you believe in individual self-fulfillment, then you have to allow women the freedom to actually make their own choices. You cannot keep them out of jobs, education, etc. Individual self-fulfillment comes first with the ability to make decisions for yourself. That justifies the abolition of slavery, and it justifies giving women the vote, access to education, and access to jobs. The reason I'm emphasizing this whole different definitions of liberty is because it's going to be on the final exam. But with that, I'm done on time. Sorry for the rush. Hand in your stuff on the way out, along with your extra credit assignment if you did it. And I'll see you, not Thursday, because class is canceled. I'll see you next Tuesday. Damn it! I should stop this recording.